Hello, friends. Welcome to Sleepless History, Friend. Today I'm going to tell you about a moment so incredible, even history books have kept it buried. Imagine a king standing before his people, wrapped in the splendor of his throne. And suddenly, right before everyone's eyes, he gets scolded by a banker. Yes, you heard that right, a king. Shrinking before a banker. This moment is one of the quietest yet most shocking clashes in history. A true encounter between Louis-Philippe and Baron Rothschild, an encounter carrying the shadow of revolutions. Get ready, because this story will show you how money can turn into pure power, enough power to bring a king to his knees. And friends, if you're as curious about this hidden side of history as I am, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Come on, let's wake up history together. If you're ready, let's begin. The king born from the ashes of revolution. July 1830. Paris had spent 3 glorious days vomiting blood and weeping tears. The fury rising from the barricades had shaken and toppled the throne of Charles Philippe, Charles X. The last king of the Bourbon dynasty. The streets smelled not only of gunpowder and blood, but just as much of freedom and hope. The shadow of the blue-white-red flag rising between the rooftops was now the herald of a constitutional monarchy. And the man saddled with this new order was by no means magnificent, glorious, or ostentatious. This person was the Duke of Orleans, Louis-Philippe. With the caution taught by his years in exile, he advanced not towards the throne, but almost as if crawling onto it. He disliked ceremonies. He detested golden gilded carriages of state. He held no coronation. He declared himself not the King of France, but the King of the French. This was less a historical nuance and more like a guarantee to the spirit of the revolution. A promise to the people. Those who saw him were astonished. A simple, unostentatious suit and that famous green umbrella always under his arm. This was not a royal emblem, but the image of a middle-class bourgeois on his way to work. And the people of Paris loved this image. The title Citizen King circulated through the streets like a lullaby. He shook hands with the public at the Palais Royal, asked vendors about prices in the markets, and patted children on the head. Was this a sincere performance or an instinctive camouflage ability born from years of exile? No one could be sure. Perhaps not even he himself. But behind this simple image lay a will of steel and a deep political strategy. Louis-Philippe was a master of balance. He was walking a tightrope between the extremism of the revolutionaries and the reactionism of the aristocrats. His goal was to find the golden mean. Neither to the right nor to the left, only forward. Believing in progress that served the interests of the bourgeoisie and the continuity of order. In one of the most secluded rooms of the palace, looking out the window at the new Paris under construction, he said to his advisor, "Benut, I will govern this country as if managing a company. A solid, thrifty, profitable company. We no longer have the patience for the luxury called revolution." His advisor nodded but thought to himself, if the head of a family favors only the child who earns the most, the richest one, rebellion in that house is inevitable. That day, in the evening, the king took his umbrella and quietly left the palace. When the crowd saw him and cheered with enthusiasm and excitement, he tipped his hat in a slight salute. There was a warm, paternal smile on his face. But for a moment, his eyes shifted towards the distance, towards Rue Lafitte, one of the new France's real centers of power. There, a man named Baron James de Rothschild was quietly building his own financial empire. Somewhere deep inside, the king felt that one day he would be compelled to go to that door. The citizen king was walking among his people, but the paths beneath his feet were still made of the fragile ashes of a revolution. The king of money, the rise of Baron James. Rue Lafitte was one of the arteries where the pulse of the new Paris beat. And at the heart of this street stood a mansion, imposing yet arranged with tasteful avoidance of ostentation. This was not a royal palace, but the temple of the modern age, the central headquarters of Baron James de Rothschild's financial empire. Baron James was in his study in the early hours of the morning, before Paris had even awoken from its slumber. The room was a place where functionality met luxury. On the walls were valuable paintings, and on the desk were piles of papers from all corners of the world, filled with complex figures and secret codes. True power was hidden between these two. He was the youngest of Meyer Amschel Rothschild's 5 sons. The instruction his father had given him, as his brothers dispersed and settled in other European capitals, was simple and clear: finance France's infrastructure, become the banker of their industrial revolution. And so he had. Like a spider, Baron James had spun a fine but steel-strong web around France. The construction of railways, the operation of mines, government bonds, the economic pulse of France beat in the back rooms of his mansion. But his real power came not from the gold in his hands, but from the information he possessed. In the room, the clatter of hooves from mounted couriers arriving from all over the world was like the whisper of a modern magic. Stock market predictions from his brother Nathan in London, political intelligence from Salomon in Vienna, family news from Frankfurt. This information network gave him an early warning system and a capacity for movement and maneuver that no one else possessed. While a king had to gather his advisors to make a decision, Baron James could shake the entire continent with the pieces of paper in his palm. One evening, looking into the flames of the fireplace, he had said to his most trusted advisor, his voice soft but his emphasis as hard as steel, "Napoleon fought with many armies and lost. We fight with interest rates and government bonds. And we win not on the battlefield, but in the accounting ledgers. Remember, to conquer a country, you don't need to take up your cannons and rifles. It is enough to seize the key to its treasury." This was a new philosophy of power. And how long could the citizen King Louis-Philippe and his umbrella stand against this philosophy? Baron James turned back to his desk. Before him lay the credit file for a new railway line requested by the French government. On the edge of the file, with a slight smile, he attached a small note that read, "To be considered." These 2 words were enough to postpone a king's destiny. Outside the Rothschild mansion, Paris was preparing to begin a new day. Inside, however, the sun never set, illuminating everything with the cold, clear light of money. The throne of France sat on a street, but the real throne of France was rising behind his desk on Rue Lafitte. The first slap, the time was a hazy, foggy afternoon in the first half of the 1830s. The royal study in the Tuileries Palace, an extension of the Louvre Palace, with its gilded decorations and heavy velvet, reflected the traditional splendor and grandeur of power. But that day, the air in the room was filled not so much with the weight of splendor and grandeur, but with a sharp tension. Louis-Philippe stood by the window, looking out as if to check on his citizen king image in the streets. On his back was an unostentatious dark-colored frock coat. Inside, however, he was churning with the stress not of a king, but of a company manager mired in debt. The French economy needed Baron James's capital, especially for the expansion of the railway network. This was not a favor. It was a necessity for the French economy. The door opened. Baron James de Rothschild entered. His movements carried not the reverence and deference of being in a king's presence, but the self-assured calm of a partner arriving for a business meeting. He wore a perfectly tailored dark suit and carried a large leather bag containing various documents. His greeting was very brief, simple, and distant. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice a hard, resonant baritone that filled the room. "Baron James," replied Louis-Philippe, forcing a smile as he moved towards his desk. "Please, have a seat. We have important projects for the future of the country. Railways will be the arteries of France, and to pump blood into these arteries." The king began enthusiastically explaining his plans, his vision. New lines, employment, the revival of trade. His words sounded not like a king's command, but like a businessman's presentation. Baron James listened to him without interruption, without cutting him off. He only nodded his head slightly from time to time in approval, the expression in his eyes as deep and meaningful as if he were reading a ledger full of figures. When the king fell silent, only the crackling of the fireplace was heard in the room. Baron James slowly opened his large leather bag. From it, he took out a single, thick file. He did not place it in front of the king. He held it in front of himself. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice softer this time, but every syllable as powerful as a hammer blow. "The projects you have described are extremely ambitious. They are undoubtedly very important for France's future." A pause. The silence that fell upon the room made the tension unbearable. "However," Baron James continued, using the word like a knife, "our risk analysis and return reports unfortunately do not support your optimistic forecasts. The current economic situation does not justify a credit request of this magnitude." Louis-Philippe's face tightened. "Baron James, this is the command of a king. It is in France's interest." Baron James looked directly into the king's eyes for the first time. In his eyes there was no subject's fear. There was the power of equality. At that moment, all the grandeur in the room, the gilded decorations, the heavy curtains, lost their meaning. The truth was written on the table in invisible letters. "Your Majesty," said Baron James, his voice now icy and devoid of any softness, "remember." A moment of dramatic silence ensued. The king held his breath, listening. "Today, you may be the one and only king of France." As he spoke the sentence, he moved his hand lightly over the table as if pointing to the symbol of traditional monarchy. Then, he lifted the file slightly into the air and uttered those famous, historic words. But the room froze. Louis-Philippe shuddered as if slapped by an invisible hand. His cheeks turned crimson, his breath caught. Inside him, the feeling of helplessness from his years in exile mixed with the flames of royal honor. He wanted to open his mouth and say something, but the words caught in his throat, because what the man opposite him said was painfully, humiliatingly but 100% true that Baron James knew very well there was nothing else to say. He slowly rose to his feet. He bowed his head slightly. "Have a good day, Your Majesty." He turned his back and left the room with the calm and proud steps of a conqueror. When the door closed, Louis-Philippe was left utterly alone. In his own palace, in his own throne room, he had been reminded of the power of money by Baron James. The citizen king mask was shattered at that moment. In its place remained the bitter truth of a king with an empty royal treasury. From that moment on, both knew there were two kings in France. One was the citizen king who walked the streets with his umbrella. The other was the one who ruled over his ledgers from his desk on Rue Lafitte. The first slap and the public humiliation. Yet this truth was skillfully hidden from the public. Baron James ultimately approved the credit. The construction of the Northern Railway became a symbol of France's modernization dream. This power struggle was also concealed behind the courtesy of official protocol. Until that ceremony, the opening day ceremony of the Northern Railway, everything was decorated with flags and flowers. Important guests, the press, the excited public, and the King of France. Everyone was waiting for the moment the Iron Giant would make its first journey. According to protocol, after everyone had arrived and taken their places, King Louis-Philippe would arrive last, and the ceremony would begin with his arrival. Everyone was waiting, ready. But one person was missing, the chief financier of the project, Baron James de Rothschild. The king was growing slightly restless in his place. Waiting in front of the crowd was casting a shadow over his citizen king image, eroding his authority. He spoke quietly with his advisors, sent messengers. The response was always the same. Baron James is preparing. Finally, the awaited moment arrived. Baron James's carriage entered the ceremony area slowly. He had arrived after everyone, even after the king. The carriage stopped, the door opened, and Baron James stepped out without any sign of haste, panic, or apology. With the air of a man who was the master of his own time, Louis-Philippe greeted him with a tense smile on his face. He was filled with anger but tried not to show it. He took a step toward Baron James, his voice as soft as possible but also as sarcastic as possible. "Baron James, you have finally arrived. You have kept everyone waiting, especially me. You have delayed the ceremony." The crowd fell silent. There was tension in the air. Everyone felt the strain between these two powerful men. Baron James, ignoring the king's words, calmly walked over to his own horses. He reached out and stroked the mane of one of the large horses pulling his carriage. He acted as if the king wasn't there, as if there were only the horse and its owner. Then he slowly turned to the king. There was a mocking expression in his eyes, and his voice carried the cold, sharp tone of superiority. In a resonant and clear voice that the entire crowd could hear, he uttered those famous words, "Your Majesty." Holding the ceremonies this early is rather pointless. He paused for a moment then, bringing his hand back from the horse's back and making a meaningful gesture in the air. He delivered the final blow for all to understand. "If only you had waited a little longer. My time is more valuable." Shock. A murmur rose from the crowd. Some were astonished, others were secretly smiling at this insolence. Louis-Philippe stood frozen. His face turned first white, then deep red. He, A king, the sole legal ruler of France, had been publicly reprimanded by a banker to whom he was indebted. In front of his people, that moment, the legend of the scolded king began to spread from the palace walls into the streets of Paris. Baron James bowed his head slightly toward the king to start the ceremony. It was now clear to everyone where the real power lay. The throne had vanished into the shadow of a man whose time was more valuable at the head of a railway line. The hypocritical peace and the cry of the "enrich yourselves" era. After that public humiliation at the Northern Railway ceremony, a strange, tense, and hypocritical peace began to reign between the Tuileries Palace and the mansion on Rue Lafitte. Louis-Philippe now fully acknowledged Baron James's power, the power of money in all its nakedness. He could not challenge him, because the economic foundation beneath his throne was shaped by the figures in Baron James's ledgers. Baron James, for his part, sustained this victory not with humility, but with even greater confidence. He now acted not merely as a financier, but as a de facto partner, even sometimes as a Board of Trustees member. This alliance defined the actors of the period in France known as the July Monarchy, a conservative regime, parliamentary in appearance, but which served the interests of the bourgeoisie domestically. And the spokesman for this regime was Prime Minister Francois Guizot. Guizot was a man with a piercing gaze and an incredibly strong will. In his view, what France needed was not more freedom, but more order and stability. In Parliament, whenever opposition deputies decried the injustice of the electoral system and the lack of representation for the poor, Guizot would rise, cast a cold look from behind his spectacles, and give his famous historic reply, "Enrich yourselves. Then you will be able to vote." These two words were like the summary of a political philosophy. It was not an encouragement, but an accusation. It viewed poverty not as fate, but as a personal failure. This statement was received as advice in the luxurious salons of Paris, but as an insult in the suburbs and the countryside. Meanwhile, Baron James's financial networks nourished Guizot's policies, and Guizot's policies in turn increased Baron James's wealth. It was a perfect vicious cycle. Railways were built with Baron James's bonds. The construction brought wealth to rich industrialists and misery to poor workers. The people trapped in misery could not vote. Because they could not vote, Guizot and his supporter the king remained in power. And as long as they remained in power, Baron James's projects continued to be financed. The human cost of this cycle was plain to see in any factory or slum dwelling. A night in the Saint Antoine district, Jean was returning home, his hands calloused after 12 hours of work in a furniture workshop. His wife was caring for their children, who lay feverish in their single damp room. On the wall, where newspaper was used as wallpaper, Guizot's words "enrich yourselves" were written. Jean looked at those words and sighed. How? Should we become thieves? The price of bread rose every day, while wages did not. For him, this phrase was not a hope, but a mockery. A dinner at Baron James's mansion. At the same hour, Baron James was hosting a banquet for important figures from business and politics. At the table, Guizot's latest speech was praised, and the returns on railway shares were discussed. "Enrich yourselves," said one of them, raising his glass. "Guizot is right. Look, we have enriched ourselves." Laughter filled the room. 2 Frances. They were like two separate planets, existing in the same city at the same time, never touching. One was nourished by Baron James's golden wines. The other struggled to survive on the cabbage soup boiled by Jean's wife. King Louis-Philippe was trapped between these two Frances. Sometimes, during his walks with his umbrella, he felt the love in the people's gazes slowly being replaced by a cold silence. That citizen king mask no longer worked. Beneath it was a tired and humiliated man, a puppet of a banker and a target for the poor. But there was no king. The cry of the enrich yourselves era was accumulating in the streets of Paris, a silent, deep, and growing anger. And this anger was waiting for a spark, the poison of humor, the birth of the pear. Parallel to the grand boulevards of power in Paris, there were narrow, dark back alleys that smelled of ink. From a print shop on one of these streets, the sounds of turning gears and the smell of acid rising towards dawn were the sounds of an era's most effective weapon being manufactured, the caricature. The master barrel of this weapon was a witty, daring journalist named Charles Philippon. The newspapers he published, La Caricature and La Chevalerie, targeted the government's arrogance and the king's hypocrisy despite Guizot's censorship laws. Philippon's small office was a refuge for young, hungry caricaturists full of ideals and rage. Here, names like Honor Daumier dispensed justice with their lines. One day, Philippon was brought before the censorship court. He was accused of depicting the king as a pear. His defense was a lesson that would go down in press history. "Your Honor," he said, taking a piece of chalk and a blackboard, "I have no intention of insulting the king. I am only drawing the truth." On the board, he quickly sketched a portrait, a realistic human face bearing all the features of Louis-Philippe. "Here is King Louis-Philippe." Then he added a few more lines. The forehead widened, the cheeks sagged, the top of the head became increasingly round. The picture was transformed. "And here," continued Philippon, drawing a perfect pear with a final touch, "is a pear. Tell me, is it this physiognomic similarity, born only from an artist's eye, or is it our lines that turn him into a pear? Or is it his own actions?" A murmur rose in the courtroom. Philippon had turned the accusation on its head, showing how the king's own physiognomy and character had been transformed into a symbol in the eyes of the people. From that moment on, the pear ceased to be just a fruit. It became the symbol of a king's greed, mediocrity, and his increasingly bloated, useless reign. This symbol became a tremendous power in the hands of Daumier. In his lithograph, Rue Transnonain, he depicted an innocent family massacred in a military raid. It was a dagger plunged into the heart of society. But he delivered his deadliest blows in his work Gargantua. In this caricature, a king in the shape of a giant pear sits on his throne, swallowing gold collected from the backs of the people, while hungry and wretched citizens wait beneath him. This drawing was the visual embodiment of the enrich yourselves slogan. The king was enriching himself, yes. But off the backs of his people these caricatures spilled out from newspaper pages onto walls, into piles of apples at markets, and onto the margins of student notebooks. In Paris, every pear was now a silent, widespread allusion to the king. Children in the streets would shout, "Pear!" and run away. The king was aware of these drawings. At the palace, when his advisors brought him these caricatures, His face would turn purple and he would tremble with rage. But he could not stop them. Censorship could not destroy an idea. It only made it more attractive and more powerful. One evening, by the fireplace, looking at Damier's Gargantua, he turned to his son and said with a sigh, his voice tired and defeated, "Look," he said, "a sword wound heals. But ridicule continues to bleed for generations. They have turned me into a fruit, and France will remember a king's face as a pear." And so it was. The caricaturist's ink proved more lasting, more staining than royal blood. They may not have dethroned a king, but they had found a way to humiliate him forever in the eyes of history, to rot a regime from within. And this poison was slowly spreading through the veins of the entire society. The ghost in the palace, the luxurious rooms of the Tuileries Palace no longer felt like a refuge to Louis-Philippe, but rather like a gilded cage. He couldn't sleep at night, pacing silently through the corridors, staring at his reflection in the mirrors. In that reflection, he didn't see the citizen king, but the increasingly distinct silhouette of the pair from the caricatures. Even his morning walks with his umbrella were no longer as pleasant as they used to be. The people's greetings were more subdued, their gazes colder and more critical. Sometimes he thought he heard cries of "Père" from a distance, then tried to relax, telling himself it was just the wind in meetings with his advisors. He was becoming increasingly impatient and sensitive. "Your Excellency," he said to Guizot, "these caricatures must be brought under control. They are poisoning the people's minds against us, against their king." Guizot, however, maintained his composure. "Your Majesty, tightening censorship will only make them stronger. Remember, we represent order and stability. But is this stability you speak of enriching bankers at the expense of the people's hunger?" Louis-Philippe asked one day, his voice trembling. An icy silence fell over the room. Everyone was stunned. It was the first time the king had spoken so openly. Guizot's face remained unmoved. "Your Majesty, France's interests and financial interests are intertwined. Without Baron James de Rothschild—" "Yes, yes, I know," the king interrupted, waving his hand. "Railways, factories, development. But have you looked at the streets? Have you looked into the eyes of hungry people?" His advisers were silent. For them, the people were a matter of administration, not a matter of emotion. Louis-Philippe felt his loneliness more deeply with each passing day. The former citizen king was now a man truly loved by neither the people nor the elites. Bankers saw him as a tool. The people saw him as a symbol of betrayal. One evening, looking out the window, he said to his advisor, "A king's greatest fear is not losing his throne. The true fear is belonging to no one, neither to the streets nor to the palaces." Meanwhile, in the suburbs of Paris, a different energy was brewing. Workers, students, small shopkeepers, they all wanted change. The "enrich yourselves" slogan had become an insult to them. The caricatures had given them courage, a language they could speak without fear. Louis-Philippe could feel it. Even from behind the palace's thick walls, he could hear the rumble of the approaching storm. He knew now that something was going to change very soon. He just didn't know when or how. He was just waiting. One night he dreamed he was a giant pear, rolling through the streets of Paris while the people shouted after him, "Enrich yourself! Enrich yourself!" He woke up drenched in sweat. That morning, for the first time, he left the palace without his umbrella. In the corridor, he encountered a young maid and asked her, "What kind of king do you think I am?" The girl, stunned and frightened, stammered, "You? You are the King of France, your Majesty." Louis-Philippe smiled bitterly. "Yes," he said, "but sometimes I wonder which France I am the king of." The ghost in the palace was no longer just the king's own reflection. It was the specter of the approaching revolution. And this specter was becoming more and more distinct. The underground fire by the end of 1847, Paris had turned into a cauldron boiling beneath the surface. Baron James's gold and Guizot's police seemed to control the city's grand boulevards. But the back alleys, the attics, the dusty rooms of workers' associations, and student dormitories were like underground rivers fed by whispers of anger and hope. One of the most roaring of these rivers was a back room of a print shop on Rue de la Lune. Here, young radicals who believed that reform was no longer enough gathered. Among them was a student named Alexander who spoke with fiery eyes. He held a torn copy of Daumier's latest Gargantua caricature tightly in his hand. "Look," he cried, his voice cutting through the dusty air of the room. "This is our king, a giant feeding off the people who thinks he's a pear. Guizot tells us to enrich yourselves. But what if we can't get rich? What if the system keeps making us poorer?" In the other corner of the room, a carpenter named Pierre, who had come from the Saint Antoine district, the sweat still on his brow, shook his head slowly. "Student brother," he said, his voice as calloused and hard as his hands, "you fight with words. Our weapon is hunger. And hunger is the most impatient weapon. When your stomach is growling, the word reform doesn't fill it." These two voices, the students' intellectual anger and the workers' concrete hunger, merged in similar rooms all over Paris, becoming a single force. They no longer wanted just the right to vote. They wanted bread. Not just representation, but respect. This underground fire first manifested itself in a series of large meetings called banquets. This was a clever method to circumvent the censorship laws. It pretended to be eating while actually making political speeches. The largest was scheduled for February 14, 1848, at the Chateau Rouge. Everyone knew this was not a banquet, but a challenge. That night, as Louis-Philippe looked out from his palace window at the city's lights, his advisor told him about this large meeting. "Let them gather, Your Majesty," said the advisor. "They'll make a few speeches, sing some songs, and disperse. The stomach and the brain are not the same thing. A full belly doesn't make a revolution." The king looked at his advisor. The expression of the once self-confident citizen king was gone from his eyes. In its place was the exhaustion of a man who had understood something too late. "You are wrong," he whispered. "A full belly doesn't make a revolution, yes. But when an empty belly realizes it is empty, it will do anything. And we have done so much to make them realize they are hungry." Meanwhile, in the mansion on Rue Laffitte, Baron James de Rothschild was reading the latest stock market data delivered by mounted courier. There was unrest in other European capitals too, but the figures indicated that French bonds were still holding strong. For a moment, he looked out the window at the city's dark horizon. A feeling oscillated within him between the financier's cold calculating ability and a man's instinctive fear. But the ledgers, as always, calmed him. People were emotional, but numbers never lied. Wasn't that so? Paris was unusually quiet that night. It was as if the city was holding its breath, waiting for what the next day would bring. The underground rivers were now very close to the surface, and all they needed was one final blow to make them erupt. On the morning of February 14th, the air was cold and misty. The crowd marching towards the Chateau Rouge was not like guests heading to a banquet, but like a silent, determined army. Alexander walked with a speech in his pocket. Here, with a deep hunger in his stomach, the authorities were waiting for them. Meanwhile, in the mansion on Rue Laffitte, Baron James de Rothschild sat with maps and coded reports spread across his desk. There was unrest in other European capitals too, but his knowledge went beyond stock market data. A man, covered in dust and out of breath, entered the room. He wore an ordinary courier's uniform, but the sharpness in his eyes and the discipline in his posture betrayed that he was no ordinary man. This was one of Baron James's fastest and most reliable messengers, codenamed Eagle. These messengers were men specially selected and trained by Baron James, who spoke multiple languages, rode horses excellently, knew the locations of Europe's secret relay stations by heart, and carried his secrets even at the cost of their lives. From Vienna, from our brother Salomon, Baron James, Eagle reported breathlessly. Metternich's position is shaky. The empire is ripe for uprisings. Our brother advises us to review the interest rates. Baron James nodded in approval. Meyer Amschel Rothschild's 5 sons were settled, like a spider's web in the critical capitals of Europe. Nathan in London, Salomon in Vienna, Karl in Naples, Amschel in Frankfurt, and James in Paris. This private network of messengers between them was many times faster than the official government mails. Thanks to these invisible threads, Baron James knew days in advance about an uprising a king had not yet heard of, the outcome of a war or the discovery of a mine, and made his moves accordingly. Baron James ordered that the messenger be given fresh clothes and a new horse. After the man left, he looked out the window for a moment at the city's dark horizon. A feeling oscillated within him between the financier's cold calculating ability and a man's instinctive fear. But this messenger network and the information from his brothers calmed him as always. Governments were emotional, crowds were unpredictable. But the flow of information in the Rothschild network never lied. Wasn't that so? The first spark, the barricade's rise date, Monday, February 21st, 1848. Location, Paris. 12th arrondissement, around today's Place de la Madeleine. The air carried the familiar DMP, bone-chilling cold of February. But the true weight in the air that day was not the cold, but the tension. The government had banned the large reform rally and banquet planned for the next day, Wednesday, February 22nd. Guizot's order was simple and clear. Any and all gatherings will be dispersed by military force. Wednesday, February 22nd morning, in the early hours, people began streaming in from working-class neighborhoods and student dormitories. They carried banners, Reform or Revolution, Equal Suffrage, Bread and Work. At first, it was a celebration. They advanced singing the Marseillaise with songs and slogans. Their aim was a peaceful march towards the banned rally site. However, the area around Place de la Concorde and the Madeleine Church was completely cordoned off by the 14th Line Infantry Regiment and cavalry units. Steel helmets and bayonets answered the peaceful banners. Noon colonne, the crowd grew and grew. Tens of thousands of people became too many for the squares. The first clash began when a cavalry unit charged their horses to disperse the crowd. Horseshoes clattered on stones, people shouted. And the first stone, like a piece of fury, sailed through the air and clanged off a soldier's helmet. This was a turning point. Now, songs were replaced by slogans. Down with Guizot. Down with the ministers. Long live reform. Spontaneously, the crowd began to pull back towards strategic points. And at that moment, the most iconic weapon of Parisian revolutions appeared, the barricade, February 22nd, evening night. The narrow streets of Paris, suddenly transformed into living organisms. Saint-Antoine, Saint-Denis, Saint Martin, these historic streets became the fortress of the revolution overnight. Cobblestones were pried up, forming foundations as strong as titanium. Carriages and carts were overturned, serving as a skeleton. Doors, window grates, beds, tables, anything from the houses was thrown into the streets. The carpenter Pierre swung his sledgehammer at the cobblestones, while the student Alexander rolled a barrel onto the top of the barricade beside him. Intellectual anger and concrete hunger had met in this pile of stone. Every barricade was the concrete expression of a neighborhood's solidarity and hope for freedom. Women and children carried boiling oil and stones, watching the soldiers' movements from the windows. Thursday, February 23rd. At dawn, Paris was unrecognizable. The heart of the city was severed by hundreds of barricades. The first serious clashes began. Street fighting intensified around the Palais Royal and the Chateau d'Eau water castle. While soldiers fired in orderly ranks, the insurgents returned fire from windows and behind barricades. With hunting rifles and old weapons. At noon that day, a tragic event occurred on the Boulevard des Capucines. A group of demonstrators marched towards the front of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Tension escalated. According to some sources, a gun perhaps accidentally went off. Panicking soldiers, without a clear order, opened disorderly fire on the unprepared and tightly packed crowd. 52 people were killed, dozens more wounded. The dead were piled onto a carriage. Blood flowed over the cobblestones. This image spread through the city like a spark. This was no longer a protest. It was an insurrection. Anger was out of control. That same evening, news of this massacre reached the Tuileries Palace. The old King Louis-Philippe was shocked. In a meeting with his advisers, he finally gave in. Desperately, to appease the people's anger, he demanded a scapegoat. Dismiss Guizot, he ordered, his voice trembling. This news was announced to the people as a victory. But it was too late. The people wanted not just a minister's head, but the head of the king on the throne. As night fell and Paris once again reinforced its barricades, the king waited in the palace with his family for the beginning of the end. The insurgents, meanwhile, prepared for the final assault that would bring the dawn and ultimate victory. The first spark and the first blood. Boulevard des Capucines. Date Wednesday, February 23, 1848. Evening location, Boulevard des Capucines. No, 33. In front of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Hôtel des Affaires étrangères. While barricades were being erected elsewhere in the city and occasional gunshots were heard, the air on the Boulevard des Capucines was filled with a different kind of tension. The news that French Foreign Minister François Guizot had resigned had spread through Paris like wildfire. For the insurgents, this was a great victory. Crowds, shouting with joy and victory cries, began a symbolic march towards the former minister's office. They carried torches and the slogans, "Down with Guizot," "Long live reform," filled the boulevard. However, the front of the building was heavily guarded by the fully equipped 14th Line Infantry Regiment. The soldiers, with fixed bayonets on their rifles, stood like a solid wall in front of the door. Their commander had strict orders. Protect the ministry building. The crowd advanced towards the boulevard from the Rue Basse du Rempart side. The sea of people met the steel wall. The atmosphere was tense. But at first, the excitement of the celebration seemed to prevail until that critical moment history could never fully clarify. What happened in that moment? No one is entirely sure. Perhaps a torch from within the crowd came too close to a soldier's face. Perhaps a soldier lost his balance in the pushing of the crowd, and others, seeing him fall, thought it was an attack. Or perhaps, at the peak of the tension, an old pistol in the hand of an unidentifiable insurgent went off by accident. Whatever the cause, the result did not change. That single sound, whether accidental or provocation, acted as a spark. One of the soldiers, fingers on the triggers, tense and afraid, fired perhaps as a reflex. Then another, and within seconds, without a formal command, a full panic and volley of fire began. The soldiers of the 14th Line Infantry Regiment, in a tight formation, began raining bullets on the defenseless crowd before them. A moment of shock. Then chaos, as torches were extinguished and shouts replaced slogans. When the hail of bullets stopped, the boulevard had turned into a battlefield. By official counts, 52 civilians lost their lives there, and 74 were seriously wounded. Blood flowed between the cobblestones down towards the Rue Basse-du-Rempart. Those present at that moment, guided by the cold hand of anger and pain, piled the dead and moaning wounded onto a carriage waiting in the street. This was an intentional and powerful symbol. They unhitched the horse, leaving the bloody human cargo on the carriage. Then, pushing the carriage and relighting their torches, they began to parade through the streets of Paris in a silent and dreadful procession all through the night. This death carriage toured every corner of the city. People opened their doors and windows. Women wept, men cursed. On every street the carriage passed, the anger grew a little more, took root a little deeper. Alexander and Pierre walked beside the carriage, shouting, "Vengeance!" to the crowds. This image led to the birth of hundreds of new barricades and thousands of new insurgents. The next morning, February 24th, nothing would ever be the same again. The demand for reform was consigned to history. Now there was only one demand, one slogan: the Republic and the King's exile. Those few seconds of gunfire on the Boulevard des Capucines had sealed the fate of a revolution. When King Louis-Philippe received this news in his palace, he understood it was too late. His reign had been lost. The flight of Mr. Smith. Date: February 24th, 1848. Thursday, afternoon. Location: Tuileries Palace. The king's study, the interior of the palace, was shaking with cries of "Republic." From outside, Louis-Philippe, peering from behind the curtain, saw that even the National Guard was now marching towards the palace with the insurgents. This was the beginning of the end. Despite his son's pleas for a final resistance, a weary gesture of his hand showed that everything was over. "No," he said, his voice broken. "I will not spill more French blood. I abdicate the throne." With trembling hands he wrote his abdication. He was no longer a sovereign, but a fugitive, the guise of an ordinary fugitive, the entire citizen king. Image transformed into tragic reality in this final scene. His aim was not to be a general, but to become nothingness itself. Not a title, but nothingness. In his final moments at the palace, he turned to his advisors and showed them the fake identity paper prepared for his escape. On it was written the pinnacle of ordinariness, Mr. Smith. Not a crown, but a hat. He placed on his head that famous bourgeois hat. Now it was not an image, but camouflage. Not a fur, but a clerk's overcoat. He threw over his shoulders an ordinary, dark, worn-out overcoat. His attire imitated an anonymous, insignificant accountant. Not a carriage of state, but a cart. From the palace stables, an unassuming, dusty horse-drawn cart was prepared. The last look and the nameless journey, he descended to the rear courtyard. Together with his wife, Queen Amélie, he climbed into that ordinary cart. He took one last look at the Tuileries Palace, the symbol of his life and power. It was now the last bastion of a world about to collapse. The cart slipped out through the palace's back gates and merged into the streets of Paris. As it passed through the Place de la Concorde, it moved through the crowd of insurgents, a carriage no one turned to look at. No one realized that the two elderly, ordinary people in the cart had, just hours before, been the King and Queen of France. Mr. Smith was traveling among his people as if one of them, yet in truth, he was fleeing from them. The journey continued towards the coast of Normandy, to board a ship that would take him to England, where he would live in exile. The scolded king had left behind his crown and umbrella, replacing them with the ordinary hat and coat of Mr. Smith. The French throne had vanished into the shadow of a pear caricature and the alias Smith. Ashes and gold. The birth of a new order, February 24 to 25, 1848. Paris. While Mr. Smith and his wife advanced along dusty roads towards exile, history was being written rapidly in Paris. The Tuileries Palace had fallen into the hands of the insurgent crowd. People looted the once powerful symbol of monarchy, throwing royal-crested furniture out of the windows. At the center of this looting was the most meaningful target, the throne. The insurgents passed through the Grand Gallery and burst into the throne room. There, they found the empty throne, adorned with red velvet and gilded carvings representing an entire monarchy. In that moment, another spark ignited. Mere looting was not enough. They had to burn, destroy, and annihilate this symbol before the eyes of the people. A group, including Alexander and Pierre, lifted and wrenched the heavy throne from its place. A human flood dragged it through the palace doors into the middle of the Place du Carrousel. The crowd surrounded this strange procession. The object that once inspired fear and respect was now a symbol of ridicule and impotence. Then, a torch was lit. Flames first licked the red velvet, then blackened the gold leaf and consumed the carvings. The rising flames declared the revolution's victory. Their smoke wiped the last remnants of the July monarchy from the Parisian sky. The crowd shouted, "Long live the Republic!" Witnessing this historic moment, they understood it was not just the burning of furniture, it was the end of an era. That same day, the French Second Republic was officially proclaimed. From the balcony of the City Hall, Hôtel de Ville, the leaders of the new provisional government addressed the immense crowd. Alexander, Pierre, and tens of thousands more watched, eyes filled with tears, intoxicated by victory and hope. The slogans liberty, equality, fraternity echoed through Paris once again after decades. A fugitive, an exile, Louis-Philippe. Meanwhile, Louis-Philippe, a.k.a. Mr. Smith, reached the Normandy coast after a difficult journey in a small horse-drawn cart. There, he boarded the package ship Express, bound for England. Upon arrival, Clermont Estate was placed at his disposal. He spent the last 2 years of his life watching the political turmoil of the country he once ruled. The true face behind the citizen king mask revealed only in exile. When he died in 1850, his mind held not dreams of returning to the throne, but deep regrets for what he had lost. The unchanging truth, Baron James de Rothschild. And what of Baron James? On February 24th, while insurgents controlled the city and the throne burned, he maintained his composure. That very afternoon, he went to the stock exchange. While everyone else panicked and sold shares, Baron James calmly began buying French government bonds at rock-bottom prices. This extraordinary risk signaled confidence. France will not disappear. No matter the regime, the master of money remains. He was proven right. The new Republican government soon relied on his capital and network to stabilize the country. Thrones toppled, regimes changed, but the Rothschild financial system remained above it all. Conclusion: the repetition of history. The February Revolution of 1848 began with great hope. But this spring of the people was short-lived. The Second Republic struggled with social and economic conflicts, and 4 years later, Napoleon III destroyed it, proclaiming the Second Empire. Returning to the main theme, sometimes even kings are no stronger than the whispers of a silent crowd. To be a king, one must act like a king. Louis-Philippe had failed this lesson. He acted not like a king, but as a banker's partner, losing connection with the people and ultimately erased from history as Mr. Smith. Baron James, understanding that real power lies not in temporary political authority but in enduring financial systems, preserved his empire. And Paris, as the ashes of the burnt throne cooled, remained, as always, a city not of kings nor bankers, but of the streets, of ideas, and of that silent crowd ready to awaken again. And so, together we explored an era where a king's crown weighed less than the numbers in a banker's ledgers. History showed us once again that true power is not always where it seems. What do you think about this story? Where do you believe power lies in today's world? Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. If you want to continue this journey through history, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. Until we meet again in another unforgettable moment of history, remember, history never sleeps, and those who awaken to it are never alone. We're glad you're here.